I mean, the first thing I can say is when Jamee asked me to talk today and to speak, he asked me to speak on foreign policy, Trump's foreign policy, and my first thought was, what foreign policy? During the elections here in the US, in pretty much every election cycle, we tend to pay far less attention to foreign policy than domestic issues. There's a good reason to pay attention to domestic issues. Trump, in particular, is someone who doesn't have a clear foreign policy framework. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where this administration will go on foreign policy, and I don't want to just rely on tweets as the basis for what seems likely to occur. So I just want to try to frame things a few ways, a few tendencies that I see, and then we can sort of think about where that goes. The first thing I wanted to say, I guess just sharing my own shock at one moment. There's so many moments. But as somebody who works on social movements and politics outside the United States, when I watched Trump at his inauguration raising his right fist, I was stopped in my tracks. This symbol of power is a symbol of resistance that from labor movements to the civil rights struggle, it's known best in the United States for Black Power, the Black Power movement. It was used by liberation struggles across the African continent. This was a symbol of demanding greater rights, including more people, considering the interests of more people and moving beyond a lot of the things that we actually are worried about with the Trump administration. The way he appropriates symbols and ideas ahistorically, I think, is also something we really need to pay attention to challenge him, not just his policies, but also the symbols, the arguments, the fact-checking has already been brought up. But I just wanted to note this because it was particularly, I don't know, horrifying at some level to me. All right, so Trump is radically defying history in so many ways, right? He's presenting a very aggressive nationalism, a jingoistic, xenophobic, racist, sexist, exclusionary nationalism. I've recently been reviewing nationalism literature, and it's so interesting, at least in the social sciences, a lot of this literature was written in the 1990s, because with the idea that this was the moment, the war in Yugoslavia and elsewhere, where we saw this kind of aggressive nationalism. It's back. And one of the things we need to do is to challenge that in our daily lives at all levels, from the most local to the global. Trump talks about America first. As far as I can see, this is the most clear framing of his foreign policy thus far. America first is clearly a nationalistic, populist framing, right? Meant to draw people in, maybe not us, but to draw people in, to get people revved up. And this is really interesting because in many ways, I mean, foreign policy is all about putting your country first, right? American foreign policy has pretty much always been about putting America first. But what we have had for the last few decades with Republican and Democratic presidents is a very strong discourse of the importance of democracy and human rights, particularly since 1990, the end of the Cold War, with the idea that now we have the space to do this. Even with the invasion of Iraq, even with the war on terror, there was simultaneously a discourse about human rights that speaks to a broader liberal internationalism from the time of Wilson about the power of democracy and the idea that democracy and peace can go together. Empirically, that's not always true. We know that. But the fact that this rhetoric is being dropped from the conversation is particularly alarming. Once again, let me say, look, the United States has talked about democracy promotion as a key element of its foreign policy, even as it backed Pinochet in Chile, even as it backed Mobutu in Zaire, even as it backed apartheid, and so many other examples we can think of. There's always been this contradiction. And I have stood so often in classes, for those of you who've had me in class, talking about these contradictions and my outrage at them. But losing the rhetoric of democracy is really problematic. That piece is gone, that moment where we can say, this leader, this person said democracy matters, but look what they're doing, they're supporting dictators. So part of what we need to do is bring that back in, demand democracy, not just locally, but globally. A side note on that, The Economist Intelligence Unit does a democracy index, and I've long critiqued it for putting all the Western countries up on top and the rest of the world further down. As of earlier this week, the United States is no longer a full democracy, but now a flawed democracy. So people are noticing. I should say, though, the Economist argument for doing this is not because of Trump's election, but what they perceive as a dramatic deficit of trust, a dramatic deficit in the functioning of government institutions in the United States that helped to bring Trump to power, but arguably which are being furthered by his being in power. So that's another thing to think about, challenging. All right. So this aggressive nationalism. Another way in which we see it, where there are parallels and not to former presidential Republican presidents, is a shift from multilateralism to unilateralism. The United States does not want to be reined in by other powers, by multilateral institutions. It seeks to go do it on its own. We saw this rhetoric particularly powerfully with George W. Bush, critiquing the UN, arguing that the UN really played no role, was effectively powerless, basically a bureaucracy that didn't function. Trump is following that. He's already issued an order to decrease the funding of multilateral institutions 40%. So US contributions to UN agencies, particularly the UN Population Fund, because they support reproductive health for women, the International Criminal Court, and other multilateral institutions. Once again, part of this is not new. Decreasing funding to the UN is something we've heard over time, particularly once again from Republican presidents. Resistance to the International Criminal Court. The United States is not a member state to the International Criminal Court, right? Under Bill Clinton, he signed the Rome Statute, which was to bring the ICC into existence, pretty much knowing that it wasn't going to go through Congress, because this is a bipartisan concern in the United States, having any other foreign entity or multilateral entity have any say over the United States. So Bill Clinton signed onto the Rome Statute. It has never been ratified. Bush took the extraordinary step to withdraw the signature, which that doesn't exist, right? But he did it. He said he did it. So this resistance to multilateral institutions is not new. I still think Trump is taking it one step farther. Further suggestion of defunding. Going against his Republican predecessors, he's also talking about the end of NATO. NATO has consistently been important to American presidents for the alliances that we have formed through NATO, that NATO solidifying those alliances, and the role that that plays in both the US being able to use its power but also work with others. Rex Tillerson is not a great fan of moving out of NATO, but who knows how that's going to come out. One perhaps strategic thing that Trump is doing there, by threatening to pull back, he's forcing Europeans to put more money in and perhaps saving the US some money. But the downsides of pulling out of alliances, I think, are pretty huge. And I have 5 minutes. Okay. So let me say a little bit about who is being most targeted internationally by Trump. And it follows something that Marilyn said. It's kind of the countries that Trump has businesses with and big business with seem to be getting an easier time of it. I heard one comedian say, well, you know, as a foreign country, if you're worried about this, just get Trump to build a hotel and you're good. And thinking more about comedians, you know, I look to comedians now to lighten my day. But Putin, so there have been a lot of jokes about Putin. Clearly both the presumed incoming Secretary of State and Trump have been quite soft on Putin. Putin, who is no defender of democracy or human rights by any means. This leads to significant concern for what the US is going to do vis-a-vis Syria, and there's a whole set of knockdown effects I can talk about in Q&A. But there are other allies or other state leaders that Trump has pointed to. The president of the Philippines, who's been engaged in war on drugs, criminality that has killed so many people regardless of their role in this people living in poor communities just being targeted and killed. El-Sisi, the president of Egypt, who came to power through a coup, has also received support from Trump. Sisi, remember, is also engaged in a very harsh crackdown on opposition and has been very critical of any foreign actors, NGOs, and others. Netanyahu, representing the white right wing in Israel, has also been dramatically emboldened by Trump. And interestingly, this may be a product of Trump's son-in-law, suggesting some of the ways in which Trump is influenced by those around him, which may be turned off at any point. The Trump administration has discussed adding the Muslim Brotherhood to the list of terrorist organizations. The Muslim Brotherhood is a long-standing organization that has many offshoots. We know the Muslim Brotherhood best for its role in Egypt as an opposition actor and clearly a target of El-Sisi. But the Muslim Brotherhood, there are offshoot organizations in many countries. Tunisia, Al-Nahda, in government, is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is, Tunisia has been a bright spot in the Arab Spring, as much difficulty as they've had. Al-Nahda has compromised again and again, but nonetheless could fall under this, depending upon, whether or not it goes through, which it seems that it would be difficult to bring it through. But once again, just to draw attention to it. Individuals in the State Department have said there's no legal justification for adding the Muslim Brotherhood to the terrorist list, but nonetheless, it's there. Other governments that could be affected by this, which also suggests it's probably a little less likely, is the Turkish government. The AKP is also not a direct Muslim Brotherhood organization, but an offshoot there. What's the common theme here? It's pretty clear, right? The common thread of the organizations that could be targeted through this is not their use of violence, but the role of Muslim identity in their self-understanding. So it is very direct targeting of Muslim organizations. And it's, once again, we've talked about this so much, but it's another attempt to equate Islam with terrorism, something that everybody can play a role in challenging, critiquing, and offering alternatives to. Bright spots. People are resisting in all sorts of unusual places. Somebody who I wouldn't expect to quote, but Angela Merkel, the Bundeskanzler of Germany, has pushed back against Trump. She was one of the leaders early on who challenged him. Her congratulatory comment to Trump was that she was happy to work with the US, that Germany and the US had many things in common. I'll quote now. Values of democracy, freedom, and respect for law and the dignity of man, independent of origin, skin color, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or political views. And then she said, I offer the next president of the United States close cooperation on the basis of these values. The most senior layer of administrative officers in the State Department all resigned yesterday. So you're seeing people in numerous positions taking steps that we wouldn't expect. That has an upside and a downside. It demonstrates a serious challenge and critique of what the current Trump administration suggests it's going to do, but at the same time it removes a barrier. It opens up it's removed a number of people who would have very clearly been opposed to an action such as moving the US Embassy from Tel Aviv, Israel, to Jerusalem, which has a profound signaling effect for the US's role in Middle East peace talks. But I guess my point particularly in quoting Angela Merkel, although for those of you who saw SNL last Saturday, Aziz Ansari quoted George W. Bush as like a role model, so funny days, right? But the point is that critiques are coming from all different places, and that we should build on all of these as they critique specific aspects of policy. And that we should also remember in calling, in marching, in showing up to local representatives' offices to think not just about the local, but also the international, that you can have an effect there too. Thanks. Cookies.
I'll say it again. I am Janine Jackson. I'm from the Media Watch group FAIR. FAIR stands for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I also am the producer and host of CounterSpin, FAIR's radio show. Oh, and also an alum, yes. I was going to say I'm happy to be here. It's been a minute or 30 years. So, and it looks much the same except for whole structures like this. But I am very, very happy to be here. I feel like I'm among friends. So I am a media critic, not because I think news media are all powerful, right? But because I'm interested and outraged and terrified at how media create a climate that even as you're sure you've inoculated yourself against it, you know, still can define the parameters of our public conversation and shape our understanding of what's possible, including what's politically possible. You don't have to read the New York Times to be affected by its worldview any more than you have to have stock in Exxon to be affected by pollution or climate change. So I want to talk a little bit about the significant role that corporate media played in delivering us this particular nightmare, but it's not because I think they're solely responsible. And it's not because I think that changing the media is the same thing as changing the world. We do that, right? So the too long didn't read, corporate media problem, independent journalism solution. That's basically the thrust of it. Election media, corporate media, I no longer call it mainstream media, I think, in a sense, because well, it's a longer conversation. Corporate media's election coverage has always been a disservice to democracy and to citizens. Some of the first work that I did at FAIR was on the 1992 presidential primary coverage, and really the phenomena are unchanged in some ways. Shallow, superficial coverage, right, that rarely delves deeply into issues or public records of candidates, that's overwhelmingly focused on strategy and tactics, you know, how their campaigns are, how they are raising money, where they are speaking today, and less serious examination of the policies these candidates might be likely to enact if they were elected. And also this winnowing the field. You know, corporate media see elections as stories with two players who fight and one of them wins. And of course, we know that the electoral process has much more to it than that. But there is a very, and I'm speaking in broad strokes here, of course. There are counterexamples for pretty much everything I would say. But there's a tendency to want to immediately start talking about who's electable, who's not, and throwing out candidates very, very early in the process. And this is, of course, a tremendous disservice to our dialogue, because that's where ideas come up, you know, when there are lots of different candidates with lots of different positions, and we have an opportunity to think of new things, to think of new ideas. What medias want to pick immediately a Republican and a Democrat, no third parties, please, you know, and get that field narrowed down. In the last election, the last election has an asterisk, it's a little bit different, but winnowing the field and fast, and so making us lose out on an opportunity both to get to know other parties, other candidates, but also to hear other ideas. And then also a tendency to focus overwhelmingly on the presidential race and do nearly bupkis on congressional races. And that's kind of biting us in the butt now, right? You know, our interest, I think, has been said, is we do need a focus on Congress, very much so. They're going to be important players, they always are, but now they may be a buttress of sorts. So all of that behavior of corporate media, that already pre-existed. That predated this past election, of course. So my problem is also the way that media devolve all of politics down to presidential elections, you know, as if a lever you pull once every 4 years represents your political engagement, you know, and all of it. And I think that also is tremendously problematic. There was a poll by the AP in 2016 that I found very interesting, that media did not find very interesting. And it was an Associated Press poll of registered voters found that 90% 90% of them said they lack confidence in the country's political system. 90%. 40% described the system as seriously broken. This seems to me huge. This seems to me a very, very big deal. And is why media imagining that they are taking the pulse, the political pulse of the public by simply focusing on this process that overwhelming majorities say they have no faith in. So this is a disconnect. All of that plus Donald Trump. At FAIR we talk about how the goals of corporate media as a profit-driven industry conflict with the goals of journalism to serve the public interest. That is FAIR's basic message boiled down to a statement. It used to be a harder thing to sell. It used to be a harder thing to explain. Now, we have folks saying it for us. I don't know if you know about these comments from the head of CBS, Les Moonves. Les Moonves said back in December of 2015, he was talking to investors, and he said, we love having all 16 Republican candidates throwing crap at each other. It's great. The more they spend, the better it is for us. And go, Donald, keep getting out there. You should understand, of course, I know that we all know that media make their money off of advertising, and that means that the advertiser or the sponsor is the actual client, and we are the product. They deliver our eyeballs to the advertiser. We all understand that. Add to that corporate media make a tremendous amount of money from political advertising, okay? And that's what Moonves is talking about in the election season. He said that, and then later he said in February 2016, this is still Les Moonves, head of CBS, "Man, who would have expected the ride we're all having right now? This is pretty amazing. Who would have thought that this circus would come to town? But it may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. That's all I've got to say." That's your takeaway. That's your takeaway. And he explained, that's the basic one, but I want to add this a little also, just filigree to it, because he went on to say, yeah, Trump's getting a lot of free media. People were complaining that Trump was getting too much attention, but all that's happening out there. There's a lot of money in the marketplace. There's a lot of money in the marketplace. They're not even talking about issues. They're throwing bombs at each other. And I think the advertising reflects that. Most of the ads are not about issues. They're sort of like the debates media run, They're saying he did this or he did that. Doesn't say what I stand for. I've never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Go ahead, keep going. All right. So I don't need to do much more in terms of making these connections because they're doing it. They're acknowledging it. It's not, when FAIR started in '86 and we started talking about this, people thought we were talking about smoke-filled rooms and conspiracy theory, and it's really not. It really is that the goals of media as a business are simply different than what you and I think of as a journalist having as their goal. It's not to say that there are not good journalists, including within corporate media. There absolutely are, but they are working within restraints. And business decisions that a media company makes that make sense as a business decision, do not make sense from a journalistic perspective. Save money by closing your foreign bureaus. Sure, save money by not hiring a translator. Okay, but all of those decisions affect the content of the news that we are able to consume. So if you ask journalists, they would say that Donald Trump was a phenomenon, and so they had to cover him, right? But this, of course, downplays their role in making him a phenomenon. On 2 occasions, CNN aired an empty podium at which Donald Trump was scheduled to speak, while at the same time, Bernie Sanders was actually speaking, and on another occasion, Hillary Clinton was actually speaking. And instead, CNN viewers got literally an empty podium because Donald Trump is going to be here. Now, that's a decision that somebody made, That's not, oh, there was a fire and we had to point our camera in that direction. Also, he was a surprise. He was a dark horse. Who knew? Well, if it's phenomena like that you're interested in, Bernie Sanders was similarly a surprise, a come from nowhere. And corporate media just couldn't hate Bernie Sanders more, you know. The Washington Post, discovered the Washington Post once published 16 negative stories about Bernie Sanders in the space of 16 hours. I have just gotten through, I'm still irritated at the, they have this, fact-checking thing, and Sanders made a comment about thousands of people who will die as a result of the repeal of Affordable Care Act, and that got 4 Pinocchios because he talked about the future and he used the future tense. He said people will die. He didn't say they could die. So that's what we're talking about here. I want to say, though, we can't, media have a lot to answer for, is the short version, because Donald Trump did not come from nowhere. He is in many respects sui generis. There is something very special about somebody who was a television personality, then sort of fumbling into politics, and we all thought he was going to quit, right? Because like he surely is bored with this, and it would be more fun to be on TV, and But it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of groundwork, years of blaming environmental regulations and immigrants for job loss. That's groundwork. Years of saying, of directly associating terrorism and Islam, and ignoring the re-rise, never going away-ness of white supremacy. That's groundwork for Trump. Yes, Trump is horrible, but he did not come from nowhere. So media now, like a lot of us, are having a kind of which side are you on moment, you know? NPR, I don't know if you know, NPR has just announced that they will not call it a lie when Donald Trump says something that is false. Like on September 11th, there were thousands and thousands of Muslims in New Jersey cheering. They're not going to call that a lie. They had made an official announcement because a lie implies intent. And since we can't see in his head, we're not going to call it a... All right, so they've picked a side. The New York Times has decided they will call lies lies, and in the headlines, which, by the way, is where they should be. And I never understood the fact-checker column anyway. Aren't reporters checking facts? Aren't they supposed to be checking facts? Like, well, I'll read this. It might be full of lies, but I hear on page 27 they're going to do a fact check. Oh, it was full of lies. Okay. This is not how journalism works. So what I often ask myself is, what I often ask myself, and this is finally, what would good journalism do? What would it look like? What would it be doing now? I will say good journalism would first of all acknowledge that Trump is wildly and deeply unpopular, right? He lost the popular vote, and he is unpopular among broad stretches of people. So this idea of to the victor go the spoils, this automatic thing is not, good journalism would point out that he is not, in fact, a popular president. Good journalism would defend our rights. You know, journalists have been arrested at the inauguration protests, phones taken, beaten, and because they were near people who were breaking windows, you know. So we have scary predations on our civil liberties and our civil rights, not brand new, but definitely going to get worse. And we need journalists to be the vanguard defending those rights, you know. Let new voices speak. If we've learned anything, it's that the same group of talking heads who are now like, oh my God, Donald Trump actually won? Well, okay, so get somebody else in there, you know? We need to hear from different voices than the same talking heads, the same top-down folks that we get. We need especially to hear from those people who are in those communities that are most vulnerable and that are made most vulnerable in the current moment. We need to stop calling a man whose cabinet has a net worth of $14 billion a populist, all right? That's not what populism is. We need to demand answers from powerful people, and this I just added, we need to focus on what Trump, good journalist, would focus on what Trump does and not what he says, right? You can follow the bouncy ball of his brain to the extent that you want to, but he also has actions. There are also actions, and I think a focus on what he does over the wackadoodle things that he says, it will serve us better. And then finally, I would like, good journalism would not look down its nose on activism. You know, David Brooks, who, of the new, yeah, you just say his name and people laugh, I love it. You know, had this column, the Women's March, yeah, I guess you all felt good, but that's not the real work of the, you know. What has ever changed this country but protest, but activism? We know that this is what we need to be doing, but don't expect, even if you're at a big demonstration, don't expect to come home and see yourself on the nightly news. You may not. You may come home and find 5 minutes on the one guy who turned over the garbage can, and that will be the representation of your protest, and you know it wasn't like that. Don't expect corporate media to stop being corporate media, you know. What we can do is talk around them, as we already do. What we can do is support independent news, which we need more than ever. And don't believe them. Don't believe everything you read.
So I love the way you say that, Jamee. Julie you say it a little differently. I say Kushner, and then I hear myself say it, and I think, oh my God, all of you think I'm related to Jared Kushner. And I just want to start out by saying he is no relation, no relative of mine, and if he were, I would definitely disown him. I wouldn't want to be part of that family. And the fact is nobody ever recognized my name. People mispronounce it all the time until now, and now I hear it all the time in the news, and it's really disturbing. And my whole family feels that way. I just want to tell you, everybody says that. I guess I want to start with a little story about an organizing campaign I worked on. In 2007, I organized with a group of workers, 2,400 workers at the casino in Connecticut, the largest casino in the Western Hemisphere, Foxwoods. It's a tribal casino, and we organized the workers. And it was very hard-fought election process with the employer really running, you know, a very serious anti-union campaign all the time. Well, we won that election by a large margin, 60-40. And afterward, there were objections to the conduct of the election. And that's a process you can go through if you think it wasn't a fair election. And the employer said it wasn't fair because out of the 2,400 workers, 754 were Asian, 550 were Chinese. And that the description on the ballot, when it was translated into Chinese, used a version of Chinese that not everybody understood. And so that was the argument, that it should be thrown out because these workers didn't understand what collective bargaining meant. And there were witness after witness after witness, Chinese workers saying, and their lawyer, the lawyer for the employer would say, do you understand what collective bargaining means? And they would say no. And it was like 20, 30 people testified like that. And then they brought up an expert witness who was an American-born white woman who was an expert in Chinese language, and she testified about the difference between traditional and simplified Chinese, and she went on and on and on, very well educated, all her credentials were laid out. And at the very end of the cross-examination by our attorney, he said, do you know what collective bargaining means? And she said no. And I thought, this is perfect. This is exactly, I mean, people don't know what collective bargaining means, and most people don't in this country because very few people have been members of a union, as Kim talked about. And so it really is unclear to people. Often we talk about unions in a very broad sense, but a lot of people, I'm sure a lot of people in this room don't really understand what a union is or how we function. And I think it's important to know that we are democratic organizations that are governed by law. A lot of federal law affects union workers. So our contracts and whether or not they can be upheld are governed by federal law. Some of that law is set by Congress, some of it's set by regulations laid down by the Labor Department, some of it's set down by regulations by what's called a labor board. There is a federal board that's appointed by the president. It's called the National Labor Relations Board. It's a 5-member board. Traditionally, 3 members are from the ruling party, so 3 members will be Republican, and 2 members are from the other party, in this case, the Democrats. And that board, for the period of time that it's in office, makes all the rules for unions. They rule on every case that comes before them. They interpret the law. And what's happened over many, many years in this country, decades, as long as I've been organizing, which is about 40 years, there have been labor boards that have predominantly been very anti-worker and anti-union. So much of the law that's been established over the years has really narrowed the power of a union and union contracts. So whether or not you can bargain over whether your retirees have health care in their retirement, used to be understood that unions bargain for health care for their future retirees. There were laws that changed that by the labor board that said, no, you don't get to bargain over future retirees, only current members. So there's just been a cascade of rulings by the labor board that have really narrowed the power of workers through their unions. Still today, I would say that unions are the largest democratic organization in this country, a mass organization where anybody can belong, anybody in a workplace can belong, and it's not restricted. And so you don't have to believe in the church, you don't have to believe in a political organization. It's economically driven in the workplace. And we are very democratic. We are governed by federal law about how we elect our officers. There's probably as much election law for unions as there is for the federal presidential election, maybe even more. All of our finances are governed by federal law, so you have to reveal all your financial transactions as well. And all of this is important because through all of this, unions became very, very powerful at times. Because and when you say unions, you talked, Kim, about unions being defunded, and I thought it was really great when you talked about that, because our funding is all from workers. It's all from our members. So a member gives up a portion of their pay to pay into a fund, a large fund, to have protections, and to have rights, and to have representation, to have lawyers, to have researchers, to have the ability to pay for buses last weekend to go to March on Washington with the Women's March. These are all things that unions are able to provide through our resources. And defunding the labor movement has been a goal of the Republican Party and of corporate America for many, many years. And over a period of decades, there have been many different ways they have limited both the power through collective bargaining of unions, and also now they're very much going after the finances, going after the treasuries. So there are two ways in which they're doing that. One is through through legislatures passing right to work laws that prohibit a union from negotiating a contract that says when we negotiate this contract, everybody agrees when they vote for this contract that we'll all pay dues. It's not that you get automatically everybody all paying dues. It's through bargaining. You bargain with the employer, and then the members get to vote on it and say, I want everybody to pay the same for this contract. They're making that illegal in a bunch of states. It's now in more states illegal than it is. So I think we have 27 states now where it's illegal to negotiate a clause like that. So even if your union members want it, even if the employer agrees to it, the state law says it's illegal. You can't do that. So that's one way they're defunding the unions, is to make it illegal for you to collect dues from all of your members or from all of the employees that are covered by the contract. And the other way is through federal Supreme Court rulings. And you probably may have heard last year there was a ruling that was coming out of the Supreme Court. It was a case called Friedrichs. And Friedrichs would have disallowed public unions from having the right to collect dues out of people's paychecks automatically. It was like a dues deduction, and it would have made it illegal all over the country for public sector unions to have union security clauses. And so what happened was Scalia died, and when he died, the court ended up divided on that issue. So the next Supreme Court, with a Trump appointment, will very, very likely make it illegal for public sector unions to collect dues from all their members. And it's that kind of defunding that is really, really dangerous to our democracy. It really is to restrict union power. Union dues are all about power. And and even Kim, when you described it about everybody gets the same contract They get the same benefits of the contract, so everybody should pay their fair share. And that's the way we talk about it a lot. But really, I don't think we should talk about it like that. It's about power. It's just basically about unions having the power to have the resources to fight back against the bosses, to fight back against corporate America, and to fight back against the government when we think they're trying to hurt workers or, in general, hurt our communities. And so it is about a power relationship, and the employers are right in the middle of it. When you talk about the Trump cabinet and how wealthy they are, this is corporate America. When you talk about the labor secretary being the head of these huge chains and not believing in the minimum wage, not believing in unions, these are corporate powers that they're trying to control our country. And it's precisely because, as Kim said, unions are not just a resource for the workplace, within the workplace, but also it's an opportunity and a place where there's a political discussion, and it's a place for education. And union households have voted Democratic for many, many decades. And white men, when they have all those charts that show that white men who vote for the Republicans, except when they're unionized, and then they typically vote Democratic. And they want to change that. So if you defund the unions and you make them weak so they can't win a lot in collective bargaining, and then people don't trust their unions, and then the unions don't have any resources and can't take up these fights, it all fits together into one message. So what can we do? I think in this last election, and I'm sorry, I kind of went into what a union is, maybe more than you needed to hear, but I think what happened in this last election in my union, the auto workers, you should know there are no auto workers in the Northeast of the United States. Our union is made up of a very diverse number of occupations and types of workers throughout New England and in Puerto Rico. But our union in the Midwest is heavily in auto. And I think what was the most disappointing to me is that many of our members voted for Trump. And they voted, even though a majority voted for Hillary, we needed a much higher percentage to overcome the rest of the population. And I think what was shocking to me is that they voted for Trump because of the things he said about NAFTA and about the TPP and about the fact that they wanted a better standard of living. And I think we thought they would never vote for a man, even no matter what he said, if he was that racist and that misogynist, that people would see through him. And that didn't happen. And in those very states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, where we have this strong industrial base, people voted for him against their own long-term self-interest. I think what we need to do is we're going to see a terrible split in labor. We've already seen it with all of the building trades, the construction trades going to the White House this week. And the biggest union in the United States, which is the Service Employees International Union, was not invited. There's going to be a divide in labor. And it won't be the first time it divided along those lines. I personally think so be it, you know. I don't think we as a labor movement should struggle to put it back together. I think that's a mistake because we should just forget those guys who only care about their immediate self-interest in their jobs on the Dakota pipeline and on the wall, I'm sure. And we should really focus on building the progressive part of the labor movement and being part of the broad coalitions that will develop. We're already doing that in my region of the UAW. We're part of the Working Families Party here in New York. And also, I'm a co-chair of the Working Families Party in Connecticut. I'm on the National Advisory Board of the Working Families Party. We need to really build, we call ourselves Working Family Democrats. Okay, we are part of the Democratic Party, but we are really focused on building a progressive Democratic Party. I think we really, really have to push in our blue states. We live here, right? You live here now. We have to make sure that in these blue states that we push that we aim high and that we have a really progressive agenda and that we push our governors and our state legislatures to do even more than other states and to adopt the Paid Family Leave Act like they did here in New York and to push for more progressive legislation, better health care, things that will show that there is a way to a better life, and it is through being a progressive and having a progressive agenda. I think that in our union movement, we have to really dig deep and figure out how to do better education. It is critical that we are strategic in how we educate our members, and it's really, really hard. So my region is extremely progressive. Here in New York, we represent legal services, legal aid societies. These are people who become lawyers and work for people who can't afford an attorney. We represent a lot of educational institutions, graduate teaching assistants, which we're breaking ground with at NYU and more recently at Columbia. So we have a very progressive base in my part of the country in the UAW, but we also have the people who designed the nuclear submarines at Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut. We have designers of the destroyers up in Bath Iron Works. So I know from my own experience that it's really hard to talk about progressive politics with some of our members. It's really hard to talk about race with some of our members and about gender. And people really don't want to dig deep on those issues, and we're not really trained to do it. We're not really, we're not professionals. So it's really hard to figure out what is the best and most effective way to have these conversations. But we do, as you mentioned, we do have still resources and we have a forum that we can, if we push hard as leadership, we can actually make those conversations happen and try and move both on an individual level our members forward to better, to better thinking, to better politics, and on a national level, really move our politics through using our resources to fund progressive activities and to support progressive candidates and to fight for things like campaign finance laws that restrict money in politics and all of those critical things. So, I think we have a very tough time ahead of us. I think I've been in the trenches for 40 years. I think we're going to be in even deeper. And, but I do feel that hopeful, and I do feel that what happened last weekend in Washington was amazing. How many of you were in Washington? Yeah.
Or New York. New York.
Or in New York, right? Yeah, that's everybody. It was amazing, and it gives me hope that this is going to take people like us in this room. We're going to have to work twice as hard. We're going to have to fight all the time. We're going to have to be everywhere all the time. But I think we can do it, and I think people care enough that they will make it happen. So I really want to thank Jamee for having this, though, because I found it fascinating so far to listen to everyone, and I'm looking forward to hearing about the refugees as well.
Hi, I'm Mary Refling, and I am one of the 3 lead organizers of the Westchester Refugee Task Force. We're an organization that is partially responsible for opening up Westchester County to refugee resettlement. And we fought very, very hard to change opinions and change attitudes towards Westchester County amongst the resettlement agencies that meet with the State Department. The State Department once a week distributes files on the refugee families that have been vetted by the national security apparatus. And none of these agencies thought that Westchester County would be a good place for settling refugees because the rent is too damn high and it's very hard to find jobs for them. Well, we thought, wait a minute, if they can do it in Greenwich, if they can do it in Ridgefield, Connecticut, we can do it here in Westchester because there's an amazing refugee resettlement program going on in Connecticut. And we sat in on the refugee resettlement groups. They're called co-sponsors that work with the resettlement agency to host a family. They find the apartment, they collect the clothing, they liaison with the entire social service network in the community and welcome the family. This has been going on in Connecticut for about 10 years, and we looked at how they were doing it and spoke to the refugee resettlement agencies that were interested in our work, and we just got approval. This is so disheartening. We just got approval to settle 50 refugees apiece by the State Department for 2 organizations. One is HIAS, which is the oldest refugee resettlement agency in the United States, and that's the Jewish one, and Catholic Charities. And I just got an email this afternoon from Rachel Mayer of HIAS, who said that Donald Trump is signing the executive order to shut down refugee resettlement at 4:30 this afternoon. So we got one family under the wire. Our first refugee family was settled in Pelham 2 weeks ago, and I spoke with the woman who organized the community to settle that family. Her name is Kathy O'Callahan, and she was on the beach with the 2 children from Syria. She was taking them out for a walk while the parents were in the ESL classes. So a small triumph, but I'm going to tell you about something that you can do tomorrow to protest Donald Trump's signing of this executive order this afternoon. There's going to be a rally in Hastings tomorrow at noon. You should meet in the VFW Plaza. That's at the cross between Warburton and Spring Street. And it's a Stop Trump's Anti-Immigrant Agenda. If we come out in large numbers, that will make a statement. And we need to make a statement to one person in particular in Westchester County, and his name is Robert Astorino. And this is a critical time in our nation's history. We all know that, every one of us here. Those of us who are older and were young when the Vietnam War protests were going on, I talked to the head organizer of the Westchester Coalition Against Islamophobia today, and she said to me, you know, Mary, this feels much, much worse than the Vietnam War when our friends were coming home in caskets. This feels like a more serious threat to our democracy. And I'm an Italianist. I got my PhD in Italian literature from Columbia University, and have studied a little bit of Italian history looking at the Mussolini period. And one of the things that allowed Mussolini to come to power was the fact that the opposition in Parliament was feckless. And I would recommend that since our lives from this moment on are going to be very, very different if we can judge from history, I think it behooves us to do a little bit of reading in history. You might look at the history of people like Nero, the Roman emperor, Caligula, certainly Hitler, Mussolini, Pol Pot. And the reason I'm suggesting this, I'm curious, how many of you have watched the interview with the journalist David Muir? He interviewed Donald Trump, I think it was yesterday. How many of you watched that? I'm a fan of the podcast Pod Save America, and Jon Favreau mentioned that how that interview scared the, excuse my language, shit out of him. So I looked at a little bit of it, and I was looking carefully at Donald Trump's eyes, and it really started to sink in that this man is unhinged. And he has the nuclear codes. So I think, you know, maybe it's not as bad as I fear at this point, but if what we fear here, who are sitting at this panel today, if what we fear is happening, your lives are going to be very, very different from this point on. And one of the things that it behooves us all to do is to get politically active. And President Obama, another one of the podcasts, Pod Save America, they had Obama's last interview. Anyone listen to that? Yeah? And what did Obama say? He said, "You are my hope." The young activists who are coming up through the ranks right now and learning how to organize, they're my hope. And you guys are my hope too, because I'm feeling really stymied right now with this executive order being signed at 4:30 today. Anyway, so what can you do? All right, now, we don't know what's going to happen, and some of the refugees that have been recently settled are very, very frightened about what's going on in the United States right now, especially the Syrians who have suffered horrible violence under the Assad regime. And one of them said to the people who have helped him settle, he said, "We just left this. This is what we fled, and it's happening to us again." So these refugees are coming with a lot of trauma. And the United States may not be a good place for them right now. I hope that our situation will settle. But one of the things, if you have contact with people who are asylum seekers and have settled in the United States, just be aware of the fact that they've been through a lot of trauma, and it's very hard. It's going to be very hard. It's going to be a trigger watching what's happening in the United States. They may feel that Trump is another Assad. So just know that. And don't ask them also for the details of what they have gone through, because the refugees that I've had contact with, when you ask them about what they've been through, it's too fresh and it's too raw. Just leave them alone about it. So that's one bit of advice I want to give you. Anyway, what else can we do besides going en masse to that rally tomorrow? We need to change opinion. And it's going to be a long-term process towards refugees. They've been branded as terrorists. We need to reframe the discussion about refugees. And when you are in conversation with people about the topic of refugee resettlement, be a little bit wary of engaging people who can't be convinced, who believe that, people who think that Obama wanted to impose Sharia law on the United States, and see refugees from Syria as people who are bringing terrorist ideology or Islamic theology to the United States, and that they want to convert us all to Islam. You can't really. They've got their mind made up, and there's nothing you can do. What you want to do is deal with people who are in what we call the movable middle and reframe the discussion. These people are afraid, they're confused, they've heard the rhetoric. So what you want to do is you want to start the discussion by telling your own stories. How many of you have had refugees in your family, grandparents, uncles, aunts, things like that? Yeah, a lot of us have refugees in our family. My husband's a child of Holocaust survivors. So one of the things you can say when you're having a conversation with someone who's in the movable middle is, well, actually, I'm a child of refugees. And start out that way, and then reframe the discussion in terms of refugee and immigrant magic. Remind them that Einstein was a refugee, that the scientific community benefited enormously from the expertise of the European scientific community during World War II. And we want the immigrant magic. And the problem is that if our government shuts down the refugee resettlement program, we are not going to keep the terrorists out, because if they want to harm us, they'll find a way. What we are going to be doing is sending out the immigrant magic, the refugee magic. We're going to deny ourselves the opportunity to bring those people, have them become citizens, and bring their magic with them. And they're going to go to other countries. And it's bad. It's really bad for the future of our country not to have their gifts and their genius mixing with, the famous mixing pot that we are. And the way that it works is this. When they come to the United States, we learn from their culture, they learn from us, and it generates all of this creativity. I mean, you see it in music all the time. If you listen to some Syrian music, for example, it's really beautiful. And, a lot of our own musical tradition will benefit from that. Talk about your own experiences as a child of a refugee family, and then shift to the subject of refugee magic. How, if by blocking refugees from settling in the United States, we really are selling ourselves short, because these people who are coming to the United States are survivors. They are the strongest of the strong, the most determined, and they are the people who are, this is the great American story. Those, we know, we've heard these stories from our parents. I mean, I've got them in my family too. How, my mother had a ninth grade education. My father had an 8th grade education. They were first generation after the immigrants in Minnesota, where I grew up. And I have a PhD from Columbia University. That's immigrant magic. That's what happens. And anyway, so that's the way you can frame the discussion. Frame it in terms of we're all children of immigrants, we're all children of refugees, and we need the immigrant magic, we need the refugee magic that they're bringing to us. What can you do? I have a couple things here that I'd be happy to hand out to you. The Westchester Refugee Task Force made these for store windows, for bulletin boards, for dorm doors. It says, refugees welcome here. So please come and take one. You can post it. And also, since our democracy, the future of our democracy lies in your hands, one of the places that you can learn your skills is by volunteering, and I have a list here of our favorite refugee resettlement agencies. You can follow them, contribute to them, and maybe think about doing an internship with them in the near future. It's a full variety of organizations. One of them, if you're interested in pursuing a legal career, you can work with Human Rights First, which is a group of lawyers who volunteer their time to help asylum seekers get asylum status in the United States. We've got Catholic Charities, we've got HIAS, the two refugee resettlement agencies that will be welcoming refugees to the United States after the legal business settles, because the ACLU is going to slap a lawsuit now on the Trump administration, but it's still going to shut down the refugee program. But hopefully HIAS and Catholic Charities will be able to start settling refugees before too long. IRIS in Connecticut, so you can all volunteer with these agencies. And if there are no refugees to help settle for the next several months, there's an organization in Africa. South Sudan is on the verge of breaking into serious ethnic violence right now. And there's a friend of ours in Connecticut who tries to get refugees out of the overcrowded camps in Kenya or wherever they are, and settles them in Ethiopia. And you can, like, for a couple $1,000s, you can get a hut. You can construct a house for them so they get out of the camps. So there are things that we can do. I wish you all very luck. Looking at this overcrowded auditorium today really gives me hope, because the future, like I said, our lives from this point on are going to be very different, and the future of our democracy lies in your hands. Thank you for coming.
Sure. Hi. Yes, you can hear me? I'll be quick, and I'm Charles Zerner, and I teach environmental studies here. And I'm thrilled to join a distinguished panel. I only have a few comments that I'd like to share with you that haven't been covered yet. These are thoughts. It's not a mandate, but I was trying to think about, I'm cutting to the quick in a longer thing that I had written out. I'd like to offer you some thoughts about your contribution. Of course, we've talked about the pragmatics on a number of levels, whether it's legislation, whether it's lobbying, whether it's grassroots mobilization. Here's what I would like to offer. I'm going to describe myself as a representative of the Republic of Arts and Letters. I teach environmental humanities. Please don't underestimate the power of your imagination and the power of the unpredictable, the incredible surprise of artistic creativity to shape and to shock the political sensibility of individuals and the larger society. Artists and writers make the invisible visible. The hidden becomes accessible to the senses and to the mind, and we need that kind of visibility to have some traction in public policy. They render the veil of alt-facts and show us something real. Rachel Carson, writing alone in her house on the coast of Maine when she was dying of cancer, wrote a text by herself that literally stood the world of environmental policy and politics on its head. Carson was a thinker and a writer. She was also a scientist and a storyteller. In short, she was an artist. Like women all over the world, she knew how to network. So she wrote to entomologists, to industrial toxicologists. She scanned the emerging literature of facts, and then got out on the road to publicize her book and to make visible what she learned. That we are poisoning the world and ourselves through the chemicals that were the fruits of World War II, organic chemistry, and nitrates, which we were using to burn cities. We learned how to put it on our fields and create industrial agriculture. And she realized and articulated the fundamental ecological truth: everything is related to everything else. Think about this, the power of Joel Sternfeld, who works in this studio, to shape the history and texture of New York skyline. His images of a feral, weedy landscape above the streets of New York have saved a relic and made it accessible to the public. Think of the photograph by a Vietnamese journalist of a 9-year-old girl, Kim Phuoc, screaming, completely naked and exposed. She had ripped her clothing off her back to get the napalm that was burning her skin, dropped by US jets away from her. That picture, one image, scorched the political sensibility of an entire generation. Mine. I'm hoping this is a school that supports creativity and imagination with all the wisdom, programmatic, political, economic wisdom from leaders of advocacy. I'm hoping that you also think about and embrace your own capacity to write, to dance, to imagine forms of resistance that don't yet exist. I'm speaking for the power of the unexpected, the emergent, and the imaginative. So welcome a class of Sarah Lawrence to the Republic of Letters and Arts and contribute to the resistance. That's it.